The millionaire who never falls in love makes a bet with friends to win over the most impossible girl in the city, a poor activist who hates him.
The overhead speaker crackled as Madison Wheeler rushed through Terminal B of Denver International Airport, her weathered carry-on bag bouncing against her hip. Running late for her shift wasn't exactly the impression she wanted to make, especially not today. After 6 years of working as a flight attendant for budget airlines, this was her first week with Premier Airways, and she couldn't afford any mistakes. Last call for flight attendant Wheeler. Please report to gate B15 immediately. Madison quickened her pace, her sensible shoes clicking against the polished floor. At 32, she had finally landed her dream job with a major airline, leaving behind the chaos of discount carriers. The upgrade in her career meant she could finally afford to visit her family in Boston more often, starting with today's flight. As she approached the gate, Madison spotted her supervisor, Nancy Chun, tapping her watch with a stern expression. Wheeler, cutting it close. Get changed and ready for boarding in 10 minutes. Yes, ma'am? Sorry. The shuttle from staff parking was delayed, Madison explained, hurrying toward the crew room. She changed into her crisp new uniform, a navy blue dress with Premier Airways silver wings pinned perfectly at her lapel. After quickly touching up her auburn hair and applying a fresh coat of lipstick, she emerged ready for duty. The boarding process went smoothly until first class. Madison was checking seat numbers when she noticed something unusual in row 2. A distinguished-looking man in his early 40s sat alone, his tailored suit and confident demeanor marking him as someone accustomed to luxury. What caught her attention wasn't his appearance, but rather the way he kept glancing anxiously at his phone while running his fingers through his salt and pepper hair. "Sir, can I help you with anything?" Madison asked, maintaining her professional smile. He looked up, revealing striking blue eyes filled with worry. "Actually, yes. I'm Alexander Nash, and I'm in a bit of a situation." He lowered his voice. "I'm supposed to be meeting my parents on this flight. They're in row 1, and they think I'm bringing my fiancée to meet them." Madison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your fiancée?" "The fiancée who doesn't exist," he admitted, loosening his blue silk tie. "I told them I was engaged 6 months ago to get them off my back about settling down. They live in Boston, so it was easy to keep up the pretense from Denver. But now they've surprised me by booking this flight to meet her." Before Madison could respond, an elderly couple in row 1 turned around. The woman's face lit up with excitement. "Alex, darling, is she here yet? Your father and I are dying to meet her." Alexander's face paled. He grabbed Madison's wrist gently and whispered, "I'll pay you $10,000 to pretend to be my fiancée for this flight, please." Madison's heart stopped. $10,000 was exactly what she needed to help her younger sister pay for her final semester of nursing school. But pretending to be a passenger? She could lose her new job if anyone found out. "I can't," she whispered back. "I'm working this flight. It would be impossible." Alexander's eyes darted to the other flight attendants, then back to Madison. "Wait here." He stood up and walked purposefully to the front of the plane, where he engaged in a quiet conversation with the lead flight attendant. Madison watched in amazement as money changed hands, and moments later, Nancy approached her. "Wheeler, there's been a change of plans. Mr. Nash has arranged for you to be relieved of duty for this flight. Another attendant will take your shift, and you'll be positioned as a deadheading crew member in first class." Nancy looked suspicious but continued. "Apparently, he's some big-shot CEO who makes regular donations to our airline's charitable foundation. Whatever's going on, don't make me regret this." Madison stood frozen, her mind racing. This was crazy. This was absolutely insane. But as she looked at Alexander's pleading eyes, then at the eager faces of his parents, something inside her sparked. Maybe it was the romance of this situation, or perhaps it was the thought of her sister's dream finally being within reach. Either way, she found herself nodding. "I'll need to change," she managed to say. 20 minutes later, Madison emerged from the bathroom wearing the only non-uniform outfit in her carry-on, a simple black dress. She'd packed for dinner with her family. Her heart pounded as she approached row 2, where Alexander stood waiting. "Charlotte, sweetheart," he called out loudly enough for his parents to hear, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "I was worried you wouldn't make it." Madison felt the warmth of his cologne envelop her as he whispered in her ear, "I'm so sorry about this. I promise I'll make it worth your while. Just follow my lead." As they sat down together, Alexander's mother turned around fully in her seat, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Charlotte, dear, we've heard so much about you. Alex says you're a flight instructor?" Madison shot Alexander a quick glance. He squeezed her hand reassuringly under the armrest, and she felt a surprising flutter in her stomach at his touch. "Actually, Mom," Alexander smoothly interjected, "Charlotte recently made a career change. That's part of why I fell in love with her, her courage to pursue her dreams." As the plane began its taxi down the runway, Madison realized she was embarking on two journeys, one to Boston and another into what could be either the biggest mistake or the most extraordinary adventure of her life. The weight of Alexander's hand in hers felt both terrifying and thrilling, like standing on the edge of a cliff, preparing to fly. Little did she know that this 6-hour flight would change everything, not just for her bank account, but for her heart as well. "So tell us, how did you two meet?" Mrs. Nash leaned over her seat again, her pearl necklace catching the cabin lights. The seatbelt sign had just turned off, and Madison felt trapped in more ways than one. Alexander shifted in his leather seat, his arm brushing against Madison's. "Actually, Mom, it's quite a funny story." He turned to Madison with a gleam in his eye. "Would you like to tell it, sweetheart?" Madison's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of 3 pairs of eyes on her, waiting. In her years as a flight attendant, she'd learned to think quickly on her feet. "We met at a coffee shop," she began, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I was actually having a terrible day." "The worst," Alexander chimed in, following her lead with remarkable ease. She had just spilled coffee all over her laptop. Madison caught his cue and continued, weaving truth into their fiction. "I was trying to apply for a new job, and everything that could go wrong was going wrong. And then this man in an expensive suit offered me his laptop to finish my application." "She refused at first," Alexander added, his voice warm with manufactured memory. "Quite stubborn, actually, but I insisted on helping." Mrs. Nash clasped her hands together. "Oh, that's so like you, Alex. Always the gentleman." Mr. Nash, who had been quietly observing until now, finally spoke. "And what made you finally say yes to his help, Charlotte?" Madison looked at Alexander, really looked at him for the first time since this charade began. In the soft cabin light, she noticed faint laugh lines around his eyes, a small scar above his right eyebrow. Details that made him human, not just some wealthy CEO playing games with people's lives. "He was persistent," she said softly, "but not in an aggressive way. He just saw someone having a rough day and decided to be kind. Sometimes that's all it takes." Alexander's hand found hers again, and this time it felt less like an act. "I remember thinking how gracefully she handled the whole disaster," he said, his thumb absently tracing circles on her palm. "Most people would have been cursing or crying, but she just took a deep breath and started cleaning up the mess. That's when I knew she was different." A flight attendant, one Madison recognized as Jessica from orientation, approached with the drink cart. "Can I offer you anything?" "Champagne for everyone," Alexander announced. "We're celebrating, after all." As Jessica poured, Madison noticed her curious glance. They had trained together just last week, and now here Madison sat in first class, holding hands with a CEO. She prayed Jessica would be discreet. To Alex and Charlotte, Mrs. Nash declared once everyone had their glasses. "Finally, we get to meet the woman who captured our son's heart." Madison sipped her champagne, the bubbles dancing on her tongue. 6 hours. She just had to maintain this facade for 6 hours. Then she'd never see these people again. And her sister's tuition would be paid. Simple. Except nothing felt simple anymore. Not with Alexander's hands still holding hers. Not with his parents beaming at her with such genuine joy. And certainly not with the guilty knowledge that every word out of her mouth was a lie. "Charlotte, dear, Mrs. Nash continued, you must join us for dinner tonight. We have reservations at Sorolina. Alex has told us so much about you, but we want to know everything." Madison nearly choked on her champagne. This was not part of the deal. She felt Alexander tense beside her. "Actually, Mom," he started, but his mother waved him off. "No excuses. We came all this way to meet Charlotte, and one dinner is the least you can give us." She turned her warm smile to Madison. "Unless you have other plans, dear." Before Madison could respond, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. Drinks rattled, and the overhead bins creaked. The captain's voice came over the intercom, requesting everyone to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Madison welcomed the interruption, using the moment to gather her thoughts. She should say no. She had to say no. Her own family was waiting for her in Boston, and this charade was only supposed to last a flight. But as the plane steadied itself, she caught sight of Mrs. Nash's hopeful expression, so similar to her own mother's. She thought about her sister Rachel, working double shifts at the diner while studying for nursing exams. $10,000 would change Rachel's life, but was it worth diving deeper into this deception? Alexander squeezed her hand, drawing her attention. In his eyes, she saw an apology, an understanding, and something else. A plea, perhaps? The turbulence had subsided, but Madison's heart was still shaking. "I'd love to join you for dinner," she heard herself say, the words escaping before she could catch them. "Thank you for the invitation." As his parents turned back around, clearly delighted, Alexander leaned close to her ear. "I'll double it," he whispered. $20,000 for dinner. "I'm so sorry about this." Madison closed her eyes, feeling the plane cruise at 35,000 feet. Suspended between earth and sky, truth and lies, reality and whatever this was becoming. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was starting to enjoy this performance a little too much. The lunch service arrived as they crossed over Kansas, and Madison found herself studying Alexander's hands as he carefully unfolded his napkin. They were elegant but strong, with a thin scar across his right knuckles. She wondered about the story behind it, then immediately chided herself for wondering anything at all about this man. "Alex mentioned you grew up in Minnesota, Charlotte," Mr. Nash said, his voice carrying over the soft hum of the engines. "What brought you to Denver?" Madison's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Minnesota?" She shot Alexander a quick glance, but he was already smoothly stepping in. "Actually, Dad, that was Carolyn you're thinking of. Charlotte's from California, originally." He turned to Madison with a look that clearly said play along. "San Diego, right, sweetheart?" "Right," Madison replied, silently adding another lie to their growing collection. "Though I spent most of my childhood in Sacramento after my parents divorced." She surprised herself by how easily the details came, weaving pieces of her real life into this fictional tapestry. Her parents had divorced, just in Portland, not Sacramento. Mrs. Nash's face softened with sympathy. "That must have been difficult, dear. Alex never mentioned. But then again, he's always been so private about your relationship. Sometimes I think he's afraid we'll scare you away." Alexander shifted in his seat. "Mom, please." "Well, it's true. 6 months of hearing about this wonderful, and we had to practically hijack your schedule to finally meet her." Mrs. Nash reached across the aisle to pat Madison's hand. "I hope you don't think we're too forward, dear. We're just so happy Alex has found someone special." Madison felt her chest tighten. The genuine warmth in Mrs. Nash's voice made the deception feel heavier, more real. She glanced at Alexander and found him staring at his plate, a muscle working in his jaw. "I need to use the restroom," Madison announced suddenly, needing space to breathe. As she stood, she caught Jessica's concerned look from the galley. Great, another complication. In the tiny airplane bathroom, Madison splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection. What was she doing? $20,000 was life-changing money, but at what cost? She thought about her sister Rachel, imagining her face when Madison told her she could quit one of her jobs and focus on her studies. The image steadied her. A soft knock at the door made her jump. "Charlotte?" Alexander's voice was low, meant only for her ears. "Are you okay?" Madison opened the door to find him filling the small space outside, his broad shoulders blocking the view of curious passengers. Without the performance for his parents, his face showed genuine concern. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know this is getting complicated." We can find a way out of dinner if you want. Madison shook her head. It's not just dinner, Alexander. Your parents are lovely people, and we're lying to them. I keep seeing my own mother's face when I look at yours, and it's... She trailed off, unable to find the right words. Something shifted in his expression. Call me Alex, he said softly. And I know. Believe me, I know. This whole situation. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of genuine distress. I never meant for it to go this far. The lie about being engaged started small, just something to get them to stop trying to set me up with every eligible woman in Boston. But then they were so happy, and I couldn't bear to disappoint them, Madison finished for him. Yeah. Their eyes met in the confined space, and Madison felt that dangerous flutter in her stomach again. The truth is, I've spent my whole life being the person they wanted me to be. Harvard Business School, taking over Dad's company, living up to the Nash family name. This fake engagement was the first time I'd ever really defied them, even if they didn't know it. A bout of turbulence rocked the plane, sending Madison stumbling forward. Alex caught her automatically, his hands steady on her waist. For a moment, they stood there, too close in the narrow corridor, the air between them charged with something neither dared name. We should get back, Madison whispered, all too aware of his touch. Wait. Alex didn't release her immediately. There's something else you should know before dinner. My parents. They're probably going to ask about the wedding plans. Madison felt her pulse quicken. The wedding plans? I may have told them we were thinking about a winter ceremony at the Nash family estate in Vermont. Alex, I know. He finally stepped back, leaving Madison feeling strangely bereft. I'll figure something out before then. A work emergency, a change of plans, something. You won't have to be involved beyond tonight. As they made their way back to their seats, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that she was already involved in ways she hadn't anticipated. She found herself studying Alex's profile as he slipped back into his role, laughing at his father's jokes about golf and board meetings. There was something almost sad about how easily he wore this mask, and she wondered how long he'd been wearing it. Everything okay? Mrs. Nash asked as Madison settled into her seat. Perfect, Madison replied, accepting the hand Alex offered across the armrest. Just perfect. The lie tasted different this time, less like deception and more like a wish. As the plane continued its journey east, Madison realized she was no longer just playing a role. Somewhere between Denver and Boston, between truth and fiction, she was starting to care about what happened to the man beside her, about the weight he carried beneath his perfectly tailored suit and practiced smile. And that, she knew, was the most dangerous development of all. Tell me about the proposal, Mrs. Nash said, her eyes twinkling as she twisted in her seat again. They were somewhere over Pennsylvania now, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows and catching the diamond on her own ring finger. Madison felt Alex tense beside her. They hadn't prepared for this question, though they should have known it was coming. Before either could respond, the intercom crackled with an announcement about upcoming turbulence, and Jessica appeared at their row. Mr. Nash? Jessica's voice was professional, but Madison caught the slight tremor in it. Could I speak with you for a moment? Alex squeezed Madison's hand before standing. Excuse me, everyone. Business never sleeps, I'm afraid. Madison watched as they moved to the galley area, her stomach knotting. Through the gap between seats, she could see Jessica showing Alex something on her phone. His back stiffened, and he glanced quickly at Madison before turning back to the screen. Now then, Mrs. Nash continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension. About that proposal, Madison forced her attention back to her audience, though her mind raced with possibilities of what Jessica might be showing Alex. Actually, it's quite a personal story, she began, buying time. Alex might want to be here to share it. Nonsense. I want to hear your version. Mrs. Nash's enthusiasm was infectious, making Madison feel even worse about the lie she was about to tell. Was it romantic? Did he get down on one knee? Madison looked down at her empty ring finger, realizing for the first time that this was a major oversight in their charade. Her heart rate quickened as she tried to craft a plausible explanation. The ring is being sized, she said quickly. I'm a bit superstitious about wearing it before it's perfect. She took a deep breath, drawing from her years of creating stories to soothe nervous passengers. As for the proposal, it wasn't what either of us planned. Mr. Nash lowered his newspaper, clearly interested now. Madison felt the weight of their expectations and chose her words carefully. We were supposed to go to this fancy restaurant. Alex had it all planned out. Private room, champagne, the works. But that morning, I got a call that my sister had been in an accident. This part wasn't entirely fiction. Rachel had been in a minor car accident last year, though nothing serious. Madison wove the real emotion of that day into her tale. Alex found me in the hospital waiting room, still in his suit, the ring box probably burning a hole in his pocket. He'd been looking for me for hours. Madison surprised herself by feeling tears prick at her eyes. And you know what he did? He sat with me all night, didn't say a word about dinner or his plans. Just held my hand and made sure I ate something from the vending machine. Mrs. Nash pressed a hand to her heart, completely engrossed. Madison continued, the story taking shape as she spoke. When we finally got word that Rachel would be okay, I was a mess. Exhausted, relieved, probably looked terrible. And that's when he asked me. No fancy restaurant, no planned speech. Just us in those uncomfortable hospital chairs at 3 in the morning. He said he couldn't imagine facing any more of life's moments, good or bad, without me by his side. She finished speaking just as Alex returned to their row, his face unreadable. Mrs. Nash was wiping her eyes. Oh, Alex, she sniffled. Charlotte was just telling us about the proposal. Why didn't you tell us it was so beautiful? Alex slid back into his seat, his eyes meeting Madison's. Something had changed in them, a new tension, a warning perhaps. But he played along seamlessly. Some things are too personal to share, even with family, he said softly, taking Madison's hand. His touch was different now, almost protective. Excuse us for a moment, Mom. Dad, I need to discuss something with my fiancé. He led Madison to the small open area near the emergency exit, where first-class passengers sometimes stretch their legs. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. Jessica recognized you from a viral video taken at Mitchell International Airport last month, the one where you helped deliver a baby during an emergency landing. Madison's blood ran cold. She remembered that day vividly. A passenger had gone into premature labor, and Madison's past experience as a nursing assistant had helped save both mother and child. The video had indeed gone viral, but she never thought, Alex, I'm so sorry. I should have thought about. No, he cut her off, his hand still holding hers. I'm the one who's sorry. This was my mess, and now you could lose your job. He ran his free hand through his hair. Jessica wants $5,000 to keep quiet. Madison felt the floor drop out from under her, much like the sensation of sudden turbulence. I can't let you. It's done, Alex said firmly. I've already transferred the money. But Madison, it was the first time he'd used her real name, and it sent a shiver down her spine. We need to be more careful. 3 more hours to Boston, then dinner, then this ends. Okay? She nodded, but as they made their way back to their seats, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that nothing about this situation was going to end neatly. Not the deception, not the growing complexity of their lies, and certainly not the way her heart jumped when Alex said her real name. Everything all right, dears? Mrs. Nash asked as they settled back in. Perfect, they answered in unison, then shared a look that held too many emotions to name. The plane pushed on through gathering clouds, the summer afternoon darkening with the promise of storms ahead. Madison couldn't help but feel it was an omen for what awaited them in Boston and beyond. Dark clouds enveloped the plane as they crossed into New England airspace. Madison watched lightning flash in the distance, each burst illuminating Alex's reflection in the window. He was pretending to work on his laptop, but she noticed his eyes hadn't moved from the same spreadsheet for 20 minutes. Mrs. Nash had finally dozed off, her head resting on her husband's shoulder. Mr. Nash himself was absorbed in a biography of Warren Buffett, giving Madison and Alex their first moment of relative privacy since the Jessica incident. You never told me what you really do, Madison whispered, keeping her voice low enough not to carry. Beyond being a CEO, I mean. Alex closed his laptop with a quiet click. Nash Innovations, he said, turning slightly toward her. We develop sustainable energy solutions, everything from solar technology to wind farm optimization. It was my father's company, and his father's before that. He paused, a shadow crossing his face. Though calling it an innovation company feels a bit ironic these days. We haven't truly innovated since I took over. What do you mean? The board, mostly old friends of my father. They prefer safe investments, reliable returns. Every time I propose something truly revolutionary, like our recent project to bring affordable solar power to low-income communities, they shut it down. His fingers drummed restlessly on the armrest between them. They say I'm too idealistic, just like my mother. Madison studied his profile, seeing beyond the polished exterior to something more vulnerable. Is that such a bad thing? Being idealistic? It is when you're responsible for thousands of employees and shareholders. He turned to face her fully, their knees brushing in the first-class pod. You know what the worst part is? Sometimes I walk through our R&D department and see these brilliant young engineers with amazing ideas. And I have to be the one to tell them no. Not because their ideas aren't good, but because they're too risky for our precious profit margins. The plane shuddered through another patch of turbulence, and Madison instinctively grabbed Alex's hand. He interlaced their fingers without seeming to think about it. My sister Rachel, Madison found herself saying. She's brilliant too. She could be an amazing nurse. But she's stuck working double shifts at a diner because our mom got sick when we were younger, and the medical bills. She trailed off, realizing she was sharing more than she'd intended. That's why you need the money, Alex said softly. It wasn't a question. Madison nodded, trying to withdraw her hand, but Alex held on. Tell me about her, he said. Your sister. She's everything I'm not. Madison smiled, thinking of Rachel's determined face. Focused, disciplined. When Mom got sick, I ran away to become a flight attendant, seeing the world instead of facing our problems. But Rachel? She stayed, worked every job she could find, took care of Mom, and still managed to start nursing school. Sounds like she got the discipline, but you got the courage, Alex observed. It takes guts to leave everything behind, to build a new life. Or cowardice, Madison countered. No, Alex's voice was firm. I've spent my whole life doing what's expected of me, following the path laid out by my family. What you did? That's real courage. Their eyes met, and Madison felt that dangerous pull again, stronger now. In the dim cabin light, with storm clouds racing past their window, it was easy to forget this wasn't real. Then in a few hours, they would land in Boston, and this elaborate charade would end. The seatbelt sign dinged on as the plane hit another rough patch. This time, the turbulence was strong enough to wake Mrs. Nash. Oh my, she murmured, straightening in her seat. That was quite a bump. Alex, dear, perhaps you could ask the captain about the weather in Boston? We wouldn't want anything to interfere with dinner plans. Before Alex could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some moderate turbulence as we approach Boston. Unfortunately, Logan International is experiencing weather delays. We'll be holding in a pattern for approximately 45 minutes until we receive clearance to land. Madison felt Alex's hand tighten around hers. 45 minutes. More time to pretend, more time to feel this growing connection that shouldn't exist. She thought about the dinner ahead, about Jessica's knowing looks, about Rachel waiting at the arrivals gate. Everything was becoming tangled, complicated in ways she hadn't anticipated. Charlotte, dear, Mrs. Nash called softly. While we wait, why don't you tell us about your family? Will they be at the wedding? The question hit Madison like a physical blow. She felt Alex go still beside her, his thumb stopping its unconscious circles on her hand. The lies were piling up, each one making the eventual truth more devastating. But as she opened her mouth to respond, Alex spoke first. Actually, Mom, there's something I need to tell you. Something important. His voice was steady, but Madison could feel the tension in his body. About the wedding, Madison held her breath, wondering if this was the moment it would all fall apart. But before Alex could continue, the plane dropped suddenly, causing several passengers to gasp. The turbulence was getting worse, and with it, Madison sensed that they were flying into something far more complicated than a summer storm. The storm intensified as their plane circled Boston, the cabin lights flickering with each flash of lightning. Whatever Alex had been about to confess was lost in the growing tension of their delayed landing. Madison watched him grip the armrest, his knuckles wide, and realized something she hadn't noticed before. "You're afraid of flying," she whispered, low enough that his parents couldn't hear. Alex's jaw tightened. "Only in storms." Another bout of turbulence hit, and he closed his eyes. "Okay, maybe in general. I usually take anti-anxiety medication, but I forgot in all the..." He gestured vaguely between them, indicating their complicated situation. Without thinking, Madison slipped into her flight attendant role. "Focus on my voice," she said softly, covering his hand with hers. "Did you know that modern aircraft can withstand lightning strikes? The aluminum shell acts as a Faraday cage, conducting the electricity around the outside of the plane." His eyes opened, finding hers in the dim light. "Is that supposed to make me feel better? What I'm saying is, we're literally in the safest place we could be right now." She squeezed his hand. "Think about it. Thousands of flights take off and land every day. This is just another one of them. Except it's not, is it?" His voice was barely audible over the storm. "Nothing about today has been ordinary." Before Madison could respond, Jessica appeared beside their row, her professional mask firmly in place despite the turbulence. "Mr. Nash, Mrs. Nash, we're beginning our final approach. The captain expects some bumps, but we should be on the ground in about 20 minutes. As Jessica moved on, Madison caught her meaningful glance. The threat of exposure still loomed, but somehow it felt less important now compared to the way Alex's hand trembled slightly in hers. "Alex, darling, Mrs. Nash called from the row ahead. "What were you going to tell us about the wedding?" Madison felt him stiffen again, but this time it wasn't from fear of flying. The plane descended through a particularly rough patch of air, and Alex used the moment to buy time, pretending to need a sip of water. "Later, Mom," he finally managed, "when we're on the ground." But Mrs. Nash wasn't easily deterred. "You've both been so secretive about the details. We need to start planning if it's going to be a winter wedding. The estate books up quickly, you know? The estate." Madison remembered Alex mentioning it, the Nash family property in Vermont, where they supposedly planned to hold their non-existent wedding. She could picture it, a grand historic mansion surrounded by snow-covered pines. Exactly the kind of place where a CEO would marry. What? A flight attendant who had lied to his entire family? The reality of their situation hit her with renewed force. In less than an hour, they would land in Boston. Her sister would be waiting at the arrivals gate, probably holding one of her handmade welcome signs. And here she was, holding hands with a man she'd met just hours ago, pretending to be his fiancé, about to have dinner with his parents. "I was thinking about the flowers, Mrs. Nash continued, oblivious to Madison's internal crisis. "White roses would be lovely against the snow, don't you think? And Charlotte, dear, have you thought about your dress?" The plane dropped again, more violently this time. Several passengers gasped, and Madison heard worried murmurs throughout the cabin. But it was Alex's sharp intake of breath that caught her attention. "Mrs. Nash," Madison said firmly, "decision made. Alex is terrified of flying, especially in storms. Could we maybe discuss wedding details over dinner? Right now, I need to focus on keeping him calm." The concern that immediately swept over Mrs. Nash's face was genuine, and Madison felt another stab of guilt. "Oh, of course, dear. I had no idea." She reached between the seats to pat Alex's arm. "Why didn't you say something, sweetheart?" "Because he's stubborn," Madison answered for him, earning a surprised look from Alex. "He likes to pretend he's invincible. One of his most infuriating qualities, actually." The affectionate exasperation in her voice wasn't entirely feigned, and something shifted in Alex's expression as he recognized it. His eyes searched her face, finding something there that made his breath catch for reasons unrelated to the turbulence. "Lucky I found someone who sees right through me," he said softly, and Madison's heart skipped at the raw honesty in his voice. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing." As the plane began its final descent, Madison became acutely aware of every point of contact between her and Alex. their joined hands, their shoulders touching, the way his leg pressed against hers as the plane banked through the storm. Each touch felt like a question she couldn't answer, a possibility she shouldn't consider. "Madison," he whispered, using her real name again, so quietly she almost missed it under the roar of the engines. "When we land," but the sentence was never finished. The plane touched down hard, bouncing slightly on the rain-slicked runway before settling into its landing roll. The cabin burst into nervous applause, a common reaction after a rough flight, and just like that, the moment was gone. As they taxied to their gate, Madison watched Boston's lights blur through the rain-streaked window. Somewhere out there, Rachel was waiting. Somewhere out there, reality was waiting to reclaim her from this strange, suspended afternoon where she'd pretended to be someone else and maybe, just maybe, had started to fall for more than just a role she was playing. The seatbelt sign dinged off for the final time, and Madison felt the weight of Alex's gaze as his parents gathered their belongings. In less than an hour, they would be at Soralina, continuing this charade. But first, she had to face her sister, had to find some way to explain why she couldn't join her for their planned dinner, had to add one more lie to a day already overflowing with them. "Ready?" Alex asked, standing to retrieve their bags from the overhead compartment. Madison wasn't sure if he meant for dinner, for the end of their flight, or for whatever complicated truth was building between them. But she nodded anyway, because what choice did she have? She wasn't ready at all. The arrivals area at Logan International was chaos. Summer storms had delayed multiple flights, and the terminal buzzed with reuniting families and frustrated travelers. Madison spotted Rachel immediately. Her sister stood out from the crowd, still wearing her diner uniform, holding a glitter-covered welcome sign that read, "World's Best Sister." Madison's heart clenched. She turned to Alex, who was helping his father with their carry-on bags. "I need 5 minutes," she whispered. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We'll wait by the rental car counter." Madison made her way through the crowd, each step heavy with guilt. Rachel's face lit up as she approached, and the sisters embraced tightly. "You're late," Rachel exclaimed, pulling back to examine her. "And you're wearing a dress? Since when do you wear dresses on flights?" Her eyes narrowed with sisterly intuition. "What's going on?" Madison took a deep breath. "Rach, I need you to listen without interrupting, okay? Something happened on the flight? Something big. I can't make dinner tonight." She watched her sister's expression fall and hurried to continue. "But I have news, good news. I'm getting the money for your tuition. All of it. You can quit the second job at the diner and focus on your studies." Rachel's eyes widened. "What? How? Did you rob the plane?" "Not exactly." Madison glanced over her shoulder to where Alex stood with his parents. Rachel followed her gaze, and her jaw dropped. "Who is that? And why is he looking at you like that?" "Like what?" "Like you're the storm that just grounded half the flights in Boston." Madison felt her cheeks warm. "It's complicated. I'm having dinner with him and his parents tonight, and afterward, he's going to help with your tuition money." Rachel grabbed her arm. "Madison Wheeler, are you in some kind of trouble?" "Because if you're doing something illegal..." "It's not illegal," Madison interrupted. "It's just complicated. I promise I'll explain everything later. Trust me?" Rachel studied her face for a long moment. "You look different," she finally said. "Not just the dress. There's something else." Before Madison could respond, she felt a presence behind her. Alex had approached, his expression apologetic for interrupting. "I'm sorry, but our car is here," he said softly. "And you must be Rachel. I'm Alex Nash. Your sister has told me so much about you." Rachel's eyebrows shot up at his professional appearance and obvious wealth. "Funny, she's never mentioned you." "Rachel," Madison warned. "No, it's okay," Alex said, then surprised Madison by continuing. "She couldn't mention me because we just met today on the flight. And I know how crazy this looks, but I promise you, your sister is safe. In fact," he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it toward Rachel. "I just transferred the first half of the tuition money to your sister's account. The second half comes after dinner." Rachel's eyes went wide as she saw the transaction. "Madison, what did you do?" "Nothing wrong," Alex assured her. "Your sister is helping me with something important, and I'm making sure she's well compensated for her time." The way he phrased it made it sound both better and worse than it was. Madison watched her sister process this information, seeing the questions multiply behind her eyes. "Call me the second dinner's over," Rachel finally said. "And Alex?" She fixed him with a stern look that belied her young age. "My sister's not for sale. Whatever this is, it better be worth her integrity." Alex met her gaze steadily. "I'm starting to think nothing would be worth that." The weight of his words hung in the air as Rachel hugged Madison goodbye. As they walked away, Madison felt the guilt of deception warring with something else. The warmth of Alex's hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd. They reached his parents at the rental car, where a sleek black SUV waited. "Charlotte, dear," Mrs. Nash called out. "Was that your sister we saw you talking to? Why didn't you invite her to join us for dinner?" Madison felt Alex tense beside her. They hadn't prepared for this question. "She had to work," Madison said quickly. "Night shift at the hospital." "Oh, how dedicated. Just like our Alex, always putting work first." Mrs. Nash settled into the back seat, then added, "Though I hope that changes after the wedding. Family should come first, don't you agree?" The word family echoed in Madison's mind as they drove through rain-slicked streets toward the restaurant. She watched Boston pass by in a blur of neon lights and wet pavement, acutely aware of Alex's presence beside her, of the weight of Rachel's words, of the growing certainty that this charade had to end. But as they pulled up to Saralina, its elegant facade glowing warmly in the storm-darkened evening, Madison realized she was afraid, not of being caught in a lie, but of what would happen when the pretense fell away. Because somewhere between Denver and Boston, between truth and fiction, she'd stopped pretending. The valet opened her door, and Alex offered his hand to help her out. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Madison saw her own conflict reflected in his face. They had less than 2 hours to get through dinner, to maintain their story, to end this cleanly. But as Alex's parents walked ahead into the restaurant, he held her back for just a moment. "Madison," he said, so quietly she almost missed it under the sound of rain. "Whatever happens in there, I want you to know Mr. and Mrs. Nash." A voice called from the restaurant entrance. What a surprise! They turned to see a well-dressed couple approaching, and Madison felt Alex's whole body go rigid beside her. "Richard, Margaret," Mrs. Nash exclaimed. "What perfect timing! You must join us for dinner. After all, you'll be at the wedding." Soralina's private dining room felt like a beautiful trap. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the intimate space, and the storm outside made the room feel even more enclosed. Madison sat between Alex and Margaret Chun, who she'd learned was the head of Nash Innovation's board of directors. "So, Charlotte," Margaret said, swirling her wine glass, "Alex tells us you're in aviation. Pilot, wasn't it?" Madison felt Alex's hand find hers under the table. "Actually," he said before she could respond, "I need to say something." The conversation around the table quieted. Richard Chun set down his fork, and Mrs. Nash leaned forward expectantly. Madison's heart thundered in her chest. This was it. The moment everything fell apart. "I've been lying to all of you," Alex continued, his voice steady despite the slight tremor in his hand, "about a lot of things, but mostly about who I am and what I want." "Alex," his father warned, but Alex pressed on. "The solar initiative I proposed last month? The one the board rejected for being too risky?" He looked directly at Richard Chun. "I'm doing it anyway. I've been working with a team in secret, using my personal funds. We're launching pilot programs in 3 low-income communities next month." Margaret Chen's face darkened. "That's a direct violation of board policy." "Yes. And if you want my resignation, you can have it. But I'm done letting fear of failure stop us from making real change." Madison felt the shift in the room, saw the way Alex sat straighter, as if a weight had lifted. He wasn't finished. "And there's something else." He turned to his parents, his grip on Madison's hand tightening. "Mom, Dad, Madison isn't my fiancée. We met on the flight today. She's a flight attendant who showed me more kindness and understanding in 6 hours than I've shown myself in years." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Nash's hand flew to her throat, and Mr. Nash's face turned an alarming shade of red. But Alex wasn't done. I invented a fiancé because I was tired of disappointing you, tired of not being the son you wanted. But today, pretending to be in love with Madison, he turned to her, his eyes soft. I realized I've been pretending my whole life, until now. Madison felt tears prick her eyes. Alex, young man, Richard Chun cut in, his voice sharp. Do you have any idea what this kind of scandal could do to the company? Actually, I do. Alex reached into his jacket with his free hand and pulled out his phone. Those pilot programs I mentioned? They're already generating buzz. 3 major tech blogs picked up the story this afternoon. Our stock is up 12% in after-hours trading. He slid the phone across the table. Madison caught a glimpse of headlines. Nash Innovations leads green energy revolution, and CEO Alexander Nash takes bold stand for sustainable future. The press release went out an hour ago, Alex continued, along with my personal guarantee to fund the initiative. The board can either support it or fight it, but either way, it's happening. Margaret Chen grabbed the phone, her eyes scanning rapidly. After a moment, she set it down and did something completely unexpected. She laughed. Well played, Alexander. Your father said you had his business instincts, but I never believed it until now. I don't understand, Mrs. Nash interjected. The engagement, it was all a lie. The engagement was a lie, Alex confirmed. But what I found today? He turned to Madison, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. That's more real than anything I've ever known. Madison thought about Rachel's words at the airport, about integrity and worth. She thought about the stakes of this moment, Alex's career, his relationship with his parents, her own job. But mostly, she thought about the man beside her, finally standing in his truth. The money, she said suddenly, addressing the table. Alex offered me money to pretend to be his fiancée. I agreed because my sister needs help with nursing school tuition. It was wrong, and I'm sorry for the deception. I'll face whatever consequences come from this. But first, she turned to Alex. I need you to know that somewhere between Denver and Boston, I stopped pretending too. The storm outside had finally begun to clear, and through the restaurant's windows, Madison could see stars emerging between the clouds. Mrs. Nash was the first to break the silence. Wow, she said, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. I suppose we'll have to cancel the Vermont estate reservation. Eleanor, Mr. Nash started, but his wife held up her hand. No, Robert. Our son just showed more courage than either of us have in years. And Charlotte, or Madison, rather, helped him find it. She reached across the table to take Madison's free hand. Though I do hope next time we meet, it won't involve quite so many lies. Next time? Madison whispered. Mom, Alex said carefully. Are you saying? I'm saying that I'd like to get to know the real Madison and the real you, Alex. Finally, Richard Chun cleared his throat. As touching as this is, we still have a company to run. Alexander, I expect a full presentation on these pilot programs first thing Monday morning. Actually, Alex said, I was thinking of taking a few days off. There's someone I'd like to take to dinner. Properly this time. We looked at Madison. If she'll let me. Madison felt a smile spread across her face. I might need some convincing. My sister can be pretty protective. I look forward to convincing both of you. Later that night, as they stood outside the restaurant waiting for their separate cars, Madison pulled out her phone to call Rachel. But before she could dial, Alex gently took the phone from her hand. Thank you, he said softly. Not just for today, but for showing me who I could be. I didn't show you anything, Madison replied. You just needed someone to see who already were. He leaned in, and this time there was no audience, no pretense, no role to play. Just two people who found truth in an unexpected lie. Their first real kiss illuminated by the clearing sky and the endless possibility of what came next. Madison's phone buzzed in Alex's hand. A text from Rachel. Details. Now, they broke apart laughing, and Madison felt lighter than she had in years. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, explanations to Rachel, conversations with their employers, the complexity of building something real from such an unusual beginning. But for now, she was content to stand in this moment where the best kind of truth had grown from the strangest kind of lie. So, Alex said, handing back her phone. About that dinner, Madison smiled. I think I'm free next flight to Denver.